Hello, this time on Sitrep, British training of Ukrainian troops is judged a success by a government watchdog, but it warns the price has been the training of our own troops. We'll analyse the findings and hear from a major exercise for thousands of troops in Germany.
The bottom line is we need to practice this, practice it, because at the end of the day, we got to train the way we fight, and we have to train against current trends that we're seeing in Russia.
Also this week, the British-led Joint Expeditionary Force is now a decade old. But what exactly is the JEF and why do we have it, given all the members are also in Nato? Mike and I are joined by Commodore Steve Prest to explain how it all fits together. And
14 million people in Britain were watching the snooker final when the footage cut away live to the SAS attacking this building in central London. Most people had never heard of the SAS at this time.
The hostage crisis that thrust the SAS into the limelight. Ben Macintyre tells us about his new book that busts myths and for the first time hears from the soldiers themselves.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
This study of British training of Ukrainian troops, Operation Interflex, might seem to be from a slightly odd source, the National Audit Office, which is generally seen as a spending watchdog. The operation has trained 40,000 Ukrainians so far. 89% of those asked said they felt better equipped for the battlefield back home. But the price the NAO raises is not financial. It's in the training of our own troops. Mike, it's a difficult balance to get right, isn't it?
Yes, and the NAO report gives pretty good high marks to the Ministry of Defence and the government for what it's done so far. So, you know, very interesting headlines in this report in terms of some of the useful figures. So 42,000 Ukrainian troops trained so far as to this summer, £7.8 billion committed and spent. And the downsides, a couple of downsides in the headlines, is one is it is displacing our own army's ability to use the training areas. So, you know, not all of our units can get onto the areas as easily because the Ukrainians are using them. And we're not giving them much training in drone warfare, not because we can't or we don't want to, but because our own civil aviation regulations don't allow us to fly drones in a way that would give them that training. And so that's a legal problem. But there's some good stuff as well, good information in this. So it shows that we've given stockpiles of about £171 million worth of equipment. But one of the things I found very interesting is that the figure, the £171 million of equipment which has been donated will cost £2.7 billion to replace, because a lot of it's much more modernised equipment. You know, we've given them our old stuff and we've got to replace it with new stuff. So that's a very interesting figure. And of course, the other figure that we did know is that the government have committed, the previous government have committed, and this government have continued that commitment of spending $10 billion in the next decade on munitions. That's basically ammunition, you know, the munitions for the systems. So $10 billion over a decade between now and 2034. But I mean, you and I and most of our listeners know that won't turn out to be enough.
Yeah, well, we'll touch on that replacement of stock in a moment. But let's bring in Commodore Steve Prest, whose work during the 25 years in the Royal Navy included capability management. Hi, Steve. Great to have you back on SITREP. How concerned are you about the impact the NAO has found on our training from Op Interflex?
Well, so I think one of the things that is really worth bringing out, and I think Mike did so in some of the statistics, is just what a positive contribution the United Kingdom has made to the overall effort in Ukraine. And the reason for that is because it's of strategic importance to the United Kingdom and to NATO that Ukraine succeeds in its fight against the Russian invasion. Why does that matter? Because training areas like money, like our personnel and their time and their commitment, are resources that can only be committed once. So the strategy, and strategy is about choices, is about making choices about what the highest priority is. So yes, there's been an impact, of course, but we've chosen to use those resources, and the NAO highlights the resources of training areas and the time available in those training areas, to support something that is of national strategic importance. So that strikes me as being a good choice. Now, there's an opportunity cost to that, which means that if the training areas are being used for that really important thing, they can't be used at the same time for something that we've considered to be slightly less important. It's right, the NAO highlights that opportunity cost, but it is a choice, and it's a question of prioritisation. Now, the units involved who want to get their training in and want to build their own readiness and want to go through their own force generation cycles will, of course, be frustrated that they can't get on and do what they want to do. But I think we have to see it in that broader strategic context of a really positive contribution to something that's massively important.
That said, Mike, how long could we put up with this impact on our training before it actually seriously dents the UK's own capability and readiness?
Well, I mean, if we are going to do this for the next, say, 5 years, depending on the way the Ukraine war goes, and even after there is some sort of ceasefire, the Ukrainians will still need training, they'll still need help to protect themselves. So if we say this is a commitment over 5 years, then I think, as Steve implies, that we'll have to do something more about it. We can't just do create an ad hoc arrangement. And so the arrangement has worked well till now, but the opportunity cost will get more severe if we're going to do this, let's say, for another 5 years. And then we'll have to think differently about it. And I think it's a very good thing that we are a primary trainer of Ukrainian infantry. I think that's a good investment, not just for them, but for us and for our political influence and our relationship, our future relationship with Ukraine. So, there's nothing to be said against that, but the opportunity costs in training facilities will become more severe, with every year. And it's not something which is going to come to an end this year or next year. It will carry on for a while.
And Steve, as Mike said earlier, in essence, this is a bit like the balancing act that we've been doing with weapons stocks. That question, are they more used to us in our reserves or being used to fight against Russia? And then that cost of replacing them.
Yes, well, there's an old joke in the armed forces that if you go to the quartermaster and you ask for something that he's got on the shelf and he says, well, I can't give it to you because I've only got one left and someone might need it. And you say, well, yes, but I need it. He said, oh, well, I'm not sure. And to an extent, we're in that sort of situation with this. So Mike's absolutely right that what we need to do is now think about how we backfill. And Professor Clarke talked about the government's commitment to building back up our weapons stockpiles, replacing that equipment that we've given over, quite rightly. We now need to think innovatively about how we use the training areas that are available to us, perhaps in the UK. Perhaps we could use more opportunities overseas in partner nations on other continents, perhaps, to increase the readiness of our forces and make sure that our soldiers in particular, but also, of course, our Royal Marines and other elements from across the armed forces get the training they need to maintain their readiness such that we can meet our commitments, contributions, and have the deterrent posture that we need.
And Steve, these are difficult strategic choices. Would you be making the same kind of choices if you were in your role at the moment now, Steve?
Well, yes, I think so, because as I said earlier on, our contribution to the fight in Ukraine is of national strategic importance. The government has made the judgment, and in my view, rightly so, that actually if Russia rolls over Ukraine, and we've seen their interventions in Georgia and elsewhere, then actually that puts at risk some of the NATO countries, particularly around the Baltic region, and other things which we are committed to defend. And so this using Ukraine as a bulwark against adventurism into the rest of Europe, I think, is really important. And so prioritising that in order to bring about the sort of strategic end state that we need, I think is really important. And so other things must become subordinate to that.
Mike, can you see a better solution where we could keep up the tempo of training for both Ukrainian and our own forces?
Yes, well, I think we will need more innovative solutions. And I think we've got to start from the point that, as we've discussed, that this will go on in some sort of open-ended way now. It won't end this year or next year. We've got to take this on now as a mid-term defence requirement. And one of the things I'd quite like to see is more integrated training between British and Ukrainian forces, because remember, the Ukrainians have got a great deal to teach us. They are the ones fighting a real war on the front lines against the adversary that we most worry about, Russia. And so at some point and at some level, I think an integrated form of training would actually be pretty good. And although at the moment we do most of the basic training for basic infantry, but for experienced Ukrainian infantry and other ground force elements, we also offer sort of mid-level training. So we're working already with people who do have experience of fighting in Ukraine to help them with that mid-level command requirements. And I think there's quite a lot more we might be able to do in terms of more integrated approaches. And that would actually be beneficial all round, but we need to think it through on a longer term basis. We can't just do hand to mouth every year and then decide, well, we'll try and do another 25,000 this year, another 25,000 next year. Let's assume it's a long-term commitment and take it from there.
You're nodding there, Steve.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And I think that when I talked about a more innovative approach, exactly the sort of things that Mike's described are the sort of things we need to be thinking about. How can we train alongside them? How can we learn? We need a humility here to understand we're part of a partnership. And there are people who we are engaging with who've got some really valuable experience that we need to harness and learn from. So I think that presents huge opportunities. I don't think I would necessarily go as far at this stage as to say areas in Ukraine would be good areas for British Army training, in the west of the country away from the front lines. But you could perhaps think that we could do more in other parts of Eastern Europe, in our NATO members, more proximate to the operating theatre, so that we can learn some of those lessons. And as I say, there are other parts of the world where perhaps we could send our units, which will involve some cost, but effectively it's part of the cost of the support to the effort in Ukraine, where we can still bring up our forces' levels of readiness to meet their generational requirements.
It's a very interesting thought. And of course, Op Interflex has not stopped British troops in training or exercising. British troops are part of the 4,000 strong NATO exercise Saber Junction happening in Germany right now. It's been a routine exercise every 2 years, but of course, events in Ukraine have very much changed its focus. Overseeing it is the Commanding General of the Joint Multinational Readiness Centre, Brigadier General Stephen Carpenter, and he's been talking to Sitrep's Sean Greschek Melbourne.
I always say that if NATO had a bumper sticker, that everybody likes bumper stickers, the bumper sticker would be assure allies and deter adversaries. And I think when we're able to show that we're able to deploy rapidly a credible combat force, that not only is tangible evidence to our allies, but it's a credible deterrence for any adversary. Now more than ever, as all of us know, doing exercises like this is very important. After the Russian incursion into the Ukraine in 2022, these exercises and the scale by which we've been doing has increased. The bottom line is we need to practice it, because at the end of the day, we got to train the way we fight, and we have to train against current trends that we're seeing in Russia.
What message do you want this exercise to send to potential adversaries? NATO
is able to deploy rapidly credible combat forces, whether that's in Europe or Africa, or anywhere else in the world that the alliance decides to go. NATO has 32 sovereign nations in it, and all 32 sovereign nations have a vote on whether or not they're going to send their forces into a fight against any adversary, not just a Russia if they chose to attack. And I say exercises like this increase our chances of our leadership, our policymakers, look each other in the eye and when asked the question, if I send my armies to the east, who will defend my capital? They will know that answer is NATO. They have to know that answer is NATO. Because obviously everybody's got their own security issues, and we need to know that we have each other's back.
What value does the British presence bring to exercise Saber Junction?
Well, the actual capability that they brought is an aviation task force, approximately 500 soldiers, that includes not only combat platforms, Apaches, but also transport platforms. And the value that they bring is the professionalism of the British Army. Tremendous value, and we're actually going to allow them to command and control or be the higher command of remnants of the 2nd Combat Aviation Brigade, which is currently located here in Europe.
And what is the significance of that, and what complexities and challenges does that bring?
I think that the British model and the American model, probably amongst all NATO allies, are the most similar. We've learned a lot from each other over the years, and we've been collaborative for decades. At the end of the day, these two commanders that they're going to be practicing warfare next to each other, they're going to work for each other in the future. I mentioned to you before our discussion here that there are commanding generals and leaders in the British military that I'm extremely close with, that I know if I ever pick up the phone and I need something, they deliver, as long as their policymakers allow them to.
Looking forward, are you going to be making any more changes as you're watching that live battlefield unfold?
With our allies and partners, we're obviously taking lessons learned out of the Ukraine. We're actually listening to Armed Forces Ukraine leaders, and they're telling us exactly what they're seeing on the battlefield. As you know, the NATO alliance has been training Ukraine formations and Ukraine leaders since the inception of Russia's incursion into the Ukraine. So the feedback that we get from them, we immediately try and implement and make it replicate as best as possible what they're seeing, not only on the front line, but in their rear lines as well.
That was Brigadier General Stephen Carpenter. Steve, and yet again, underlying there the importance of the feedback they're getting from Ukrainian forces.
Yeah, absolutely right. And one of the critical things for me, and Mike mentioned drones earlier, is that we learn the right lessons from Ukraine, because there's lots of sort of pop culture out there about what drones can and can't do, and what's happening at the tactical level, and what it means for air defence, and what it means for fires and artillery and all this sort of thing. But actually drilling down and making sure we learn the right lessons, and then take what is applicable in a more general context, understanding what's specific to Ukraine, understanding what's applicable in a more general context, and then learning and iterating our own doctrine, our own procedures, our own tactics, in order to learn from that, and indeed our own equipment. And we've got to get better at iterating our equipment to meet the prevailing threat as that evolves too. Then I think that's hugely valuable. And as we talked about before that item, doing that up threat, if you like, in Eastern Europe, or in a part of Europe that's further east from where we are now, I think is really important. And demonstrating that readiness not only to our potential adversaries but to our own governments, the NATO governments, is massively important in building that confidence.
And Mike, that point that the Brigadier made, that it's not just about showing force to potential enemies, but also saying to 32 NATO capitals, we can defend you. Which is the more important audience right now?
Oh, it's both enemies and adversaries and our own public. And you know, it always was, because I was struck by just listening to what he said there, that in one sense, what he said was very predictable. That's what a commander would say in charge of what he's doing. But actually, it was extremely significant in a new context, because NATO has always been about deterrence and reassurance. So we deter our adversaries and we reassure each other as allies that we are a working organisation that will do what it needs to do. And of course, that was always based on nuclear issues in the past. Because we didn't have the conventional forces to meet the Warsaw Pact in the old Cold War days, we relied on our nuclear reassurance to reassure each other, to say, look, it'll be okay, we have a deterrent. And the point is, it's a bit like the Wizard of Oz. I mean, the nuclear issues, nobody ever sees a nuclear weapon, nobody knows what the procedures are, but as long as we all believe that they're there, then they work. It's a real Wizard of Oz thing. But now, the reassurance is not nuclear. The reassurance is conventional force. And the point is, you can see conventional forces. So when he says that we can defend all 32 NATO capitals if necessary, journalists can have a look, say, well, can you really? Can you do this? Have you got enough tanks? Have you got enough ammunition? Have you got enough air power? So the whole point about reassurance now, NATO's reassurance to its allies, to each other, is based much more fundamentally on conventional forces, whereas 20, 30 years ago, it was based on nuclear. And the Wizard of Oz in conventional forces can be revealed to be a little old man pulling levers to no great effect. It's got to be real. You can't rely on the mystique of it, because conventional forces don't have a whole lot of mystique. They have heavy metal and smoke and steel and fire. And unless you can see those, then it might just as well be the Wizard of Oz.
Well as NATO, the war in Ukraine has brought a new focus to another military grouping. The Joint Expeditionary Force, known as the JEF, is a British-led partnership of 10 northern European nations with a focus around the Baltic, Scandinavia and the High North. It's not formally part of NATO. It's kind of like a side project, almost an alliance within an alliance. And it's now 10 years since it was formed. So we thought it's time to take stock of what the JEF has evolved into and why. Mike, the big question for many is what exactly the JEF's role is, given every member is now a member of NATO.
Yeah, but in a way, I mean, partly because of the way NATO has evolved, that's even more important because, NATO at 32 is much harder to hold together than NATO at 15 or NATO at 16, the sort of NATO that some of us grew up with. And I always say that at 32, twice the size that it used to be, it's probably half the political strength. And that was really the case until the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And NATO's had a shot in the arm. But nevertheless, we can't take that consensus for granted. And what the JEF represents is 10 northern European nations. Not, Canada isn't in it, the United States isn't in it. The United Kingdom leads it. And if you think of it as, which 10 nations, it's easy to remember in one way. It's Britain and the Netherlands, and we're a good old friend. So Britain and the Dutch. And then you've got 5 Nordics. So, and think of it on the map, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark and Iceland, so 5 Nordics, and then the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So the 10 nations, when you want to remember, Britain and Netherlands, 5 Nordics, 3 Baltics, those are your 10. And it's been, in theory, at full operational capability since 2018. But the thing is, at the moment, it's only a framework. I mean, it has not deployed anything. It hasn't done anything yet. It is a framework, but it's a framework which looks as if it could be more important than ever because it's a framework of those northern European states who take a much more tough-minded attitude to defence, and particularly to Russia, than the southern NATO states tend to take. And so in that respect, I think it's both politically more important and militarily has much greater potential than anything else that exists at the moment in NATO, other than the whole alliance acting in unison.
So Steve, what exactly has it been doing in the 10 years since its inception then?
Well, I think there's some really important work that has been going on, and it does exercise together in exercises like Baltic Protector and so on. But the important thing, I think, is it's a coalition of the willing. It's like-minded, so there's no treaty that binds it together. And what that means is that you've got this layered concept. So it sits between the national defence, so individual nations acting on their own, and then a NATO response which requires the buy-in of all 32 countries, which might, in certain circumstances, grey zone, sub-threshold, incremental, be a bit slower in coming. So it enables people in this framework or using this framework who are used to working together because they plan together and they practice together and they go to each other's countries and embed in each other's organisations to react quickly when they need to, which will buy time in a strategic context to allow, bigger things, bigger organisations like NATO to get the politics aligned so that the heavy metal can then swing in behind. I've got a friend, she was a medical planner in the UK a few years ago, and she said, yeah, we did medical planning with the JEF. And I thought that was really interesting in the sense that, yes, it's about, UK and Dutch commandos practicing running up and down Norwegian fjords and this sort of thing, and ships sailing together and aircraft operating together. But it's also about those key enablers. So in the medical and logistics world, for example, do we understand what each country has got? Do we understand how each country works? Do we understand if we're working together and there's a casualty, and it might not be from enemy action, it might be a non-battlefield injury, of, say, an Estonian soldier working with the British Royal Marines, and do we understand how that medical system is going to work? And actually, if you've done the work in advance and you've done the preparation, it's much easier then to roll out and work together when you need to, if you've got the framework in place and it's understood and people are used to doing so. So I think that's what's really been happening over the last 10 years. I think it's also worth making the point that Sweden and Finland didn't join till 2017. So it started and they joined in. And of course, at that stage, they were neutral nations. And Mike might have a view on this because it's really his area of expertise, but I would contend that being part of the GEF and being used to working with those other NATO members who made up the GEF actually paved the way to Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO when the prevailing situation was right and the circumstances changed. So I think, what has the GEF ever done for us? I think lots of different layers, tactically, operationally, strategically, and internationally, politically, geostrategically, if you like. There's plenty there to say this actually it's been really successful, and we probably ought to keep doing it.
And Steve, when you look at the membership and that map that Mike talked about, naval capability is a big part of it, this, isn't it? With threats to pipelines, cables, and one example.
Yeah, exactly right. And of course, we've seen activity and destruction of undersea infrastructure related to the activities in Ukraine with the Nord Stream incident. And actually, it was the GEF countries who took a leading role in some of the responses to that to try and work out what was going on. And part of that is a geography thing because it's in their backyard. And so understanding and getting used to working together, as I described earlier, both in terms of just the people and the systems and the militaries, but also on the terrain, in the environment, because anti-submarine warfare, for example, is very different in the Baltic to it is in the open Atlantic Ocean. So you've got to get used to practicing and training where you might be going to fight. And that's all part of that readiness and credibility.
And Mike, one of the important differences from NATO is that the GEF can do things without needing the agreement of every member. It just needs two or more to say, yeah, I'm in. How important is that difference?
Yeah, it might turn out to be very important. As Steve said, it's a coalition of the willing, and these are the countries that want to work together, that do tend to see European security in very similar ways. And, increasingly, between North NATO and South NATO, we see security a bit differently. We have different priorities. And so the idea that GEF members, not all 10, but any grouping of the GEF could do something together is based on a coalition of the willing and capability. If you think you need to do something and you've got the kit, you've got the people, you've got the training, go and do it. It's not an irresponsible idea. It's an idea for being able to mobilize forces quickly and effectively on the basis of your national interests. NATO is hugely important, but NATO is politically potentially a pretty unwieldy organization these days. And the GEF can be, at least on paper and increasingly, I think, through the practice, as Steve has talked about, and the GEF can be a pretty flexible instrument.
And Mike, you were at that NATO summit when the GEF was announced in 2014. How does it compare now to that original version, and how much has Ukraine affected it?
Yeah, I think when we saw it in 2014, we all nodded and said, yeah, OK, fine. Another framework, good idea. We'll see how it goes. But the interesting thing is, 2014, I think, will turn out to have been a pivotal year in European security. I mean, the more I look at the 2010s, the more important that particular year is, because it's the year of the first Russian war in Ukraine, on Crimea, and then in the Donbass. It's the year when things change in the Middle East. It's the year when this autocratic grouping starts to really come together of Russia and China and Iran and then North Korea tagged on. These four adversaries who are now really very close together. They're really working hard together as a challenge to the global order. And we have now lived through, in 2024, the first decade of this real geopolitical attempted revolution. And so the Wales Summit in 2014, which was the first summit, I recall it very well, to name names. In the communique, it named Russia as a potential adversary and China as a challenge. And we thought, that's quite a big step, isn't it? And in fact, I mean, the GEF that's come out of the Wales Summit in 2014 is much more potentially important and potentially powerful than most of us thought it would be at the time.
And Steve, just a final thought. Is there a danger that we've got commitment to deliver troops, ships and planes to NATO if needed? We're committed as the framework for the GEF. We've got our own national commitments. And actually, in a crisis, we'd find a lot of people and equipment are already double booked.
Yes, well, it's a real challenge, and I think that's one of the things that the Strategic Defence Review that's currently being undertaken needs to take a really hard look at. So you're right. In order to meet our commitments, we double, triple, quadruple hat different forces, different force elements at readiness, and so on. And so it will come down ultimately to a question of prioritisation, which is where we started our conversation, I think, earlier in the podcast. But it comes down to how do you want to use them? What is the priority of the moment? Where do you want to go? And then where do you go next? So once you've committed those spearhead lead elements, what's the second echelon that comes in behind? And I think that depth of capability is something that's going to need a really hard looking at as part of the Strategic Defence Review that's ongoing. Because once you've fired the missile, you need to reload the tube.
Steve, Prest, really good to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Kate.
Now, 44 years ago, back in 1980, there were just 3 television channels in the UK. And on a Monday night in early May, very suddenly, all 3 cut their programmes to show the live pictures of a building in central London. Millions of people watched as a team of SAS soldiers abseiled from the roof of the Iranian embassy to a second-floor balcony just before an explosion blew windows out and started a fire. Operation Nimrod ended a 6-day siege in which 26 people had been taken hostage by terrorists demanding the release of prisoners in Iran. It thrust the SAS into the public glare for the first time in its history. Until then, many people didn't even know about the unit, and it changed the SAS forever. The story of that siege has been told many times, but important new details are revealed in a new book, which is the first to include authorised accounts from the soldiers involved. The Siege is written by Ben Macintyre, creator of the recent TV series SAS Rogue Heroes. He told me why he wanted to write this account more than 4 decades on.
The old joke goes that if everybody who claimed to have taken part in the assault on the Iranian embassy had actually been on that balcony on that day, the balcony would have fallen off. This is a story that has accreted myths, and then the myths get told again as fact, and then the facts inform more myths. So I really had to sort of strip it down right to the beginning. And I could not have done that, and I can't emphasize this enough. I could not have done that without the cooperation of the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence gave formal approval for the surviving participants in this story, the SAS soldiers who had actually taken part, to talk openly for the first time.
And Ben, there is a startling revelation right at the start of your book. 41 minutes after the terrorists had burst into that embassy, the SAS was tipped off by a police officer. It seems they knew before the Home Office did.
They actually did know before the Home Office did. They knew because a former SAS soldier called Dusty Gray, who had served in the regiment for many years, who knew about the contingency planning. I mean, in a way, one has to go back an even earlier stage, because since 1972, in secrecy, the SAS had been preparing and training and planning for a terrorist attack of not precisely of this sort, but of any sort. And that dates back to the Munich Olympic massacre, when there was an appalling terrorist attack there. And the British government at the time decided there had to be provision made in case a similar thing happened on British soil. So Dusty Gray had been trained. He knew about what was called the Special Projects Team. But by this point, he'd become a dog handler for the police. And he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And then he picked up the telephone to Hereford, to Bradbury Lines, to the SAS headquarters. So Michael Rose had in fact authorized B Squadron of the SAS to get moving before he was informed by the police. That came about 20 minutes later.
It's incredible. And 2 SAS teams kitted up and came from Hereford to London that night, the Wednesday. What were they doing in the days that followed before the raid itself?
Well, first of all, they were held at Regent's Park Barracks in central London, and then they were moved in total secrecy in civilian clothing into the building next door to the Iranian embassy. It was the Royal College of GPs, which was taken over by the military in complete secrecy. And the SAS teams came in through the back door on the first night of the assault, of the attack on the embassy, and were there for the duration, ready to go. The plans of what they were going to do evolved over time, but for the next 6 days, day and night, there were teams of heavily armed soldiers ready to go in.
And the raid itself, it didn't go entirely to plan, did it?
Plans, as anybody listening to this on your station will know, almost never go entirely to plan. The reality was they had a pretty good intelligence idea of what was going on inside that embassy. MI5 and the police technicians had drilled eavesdropping devices into the walls and dropped them down the chimneys. So they had they thought they had a pretty clear idea of who was where the hostages were being held, where the gunmen were, when the attack took place, the lead gunman, a man called Tawfiq al-Rashidi, they thought they knew where he would be because a field telephone had been brought into the building with a measured lead on it. So they knew roughly, if he was on the telephone, where he ought to be. Now, one key element of the assault was that an explosive device lowered down into the central shaft of the building was going to destroy the glass atrium light that stood over the central hallway and drop it straight onto the lead gunman. That was the plan. And the theory was that he should be holding the telephone in the hallway. The truth is he wasn't. He had actually moved the telephone up to the first floor. He was on the first floor landing. So when the bomb went off, several tons of glass and steel and timber and plaster came crashing down into the hallway where he wasn't. I'm not going to give away exactly what happened after that. But the reality is, like most military operations, this one depended on astonishing training, a willingness to adapt a plan to fit what was unexpected, and thirdly, an enormous dose of luck.
An enormous dose of not being lucky was that the incident, which famously was captured, one of the SAS soldiers getting tangled while abseiling down.
Absolutely. This was at the back of the building. Again, the officer you're referring to, Tommy Morell, has told his story for the first time. So we actually have a first-hand account of what was going on. This was the second team, if you like. They weren't quite numbered that way, but these were the people attacking the back of the embassy, and they were coming down on abseil lines to a balcony on the second floor where they believed the hostages were being held. They believed the hostages were being held in this back room. This first team of 4 abseilers was going to get to the balcony, throw explosives through the windows, liberate the hostages, by far the most difficult part of the operation. 2 things intervened, if you like. One was the hostages were not held in that room. What's more, that room had been locked. They could get into that room, but they couldn't get out again. And the second was that Tom Morell, the leader of this group, Staff Sergeant Tom Morell, became entangled in his abseil wire as he was coming down, the belaying device, the figure of 8 thing. No one knows quite what happened, but he was suspended. He was suspended in midair above the balcony. What's more, the other members of the team had already gone in. They had thrown explosives, flashbangs and CR gas canisters into the room. And one of the elements of a flashbang is it's not only a sort of stun device, it's an incendiary device. And the room was on fire. And the curtains caught fire very, very quickly. And Tom Morell was suspended above this fire, being burned slowly. He would have burned to death. His colleagues on the roof, who were waiting with a knife to try to cut the rope at the right moment, had to time the swing exactly so that he didn't either fall off the balcony 50 feet below or fall into the flames. So the timing of that cut, and they got it right. He landed on the floor, stood up immediately, despite being quite badly injured at this point, and he plunged back into the building, and he led that assault team into the second floor. It was an astonishing act of bravery, for which he was decorated.
Indeed. And ultimately, of course, the raid was successful. The hostages were freed, all but one who was killed during the raid.
So it was a success. It was an astonishing success, really. I mean, even the people who participated in it are still rather amazed there weren't more casualties. There was only one SAS casualty who shot off the top of his finger by accident. That there were not more people gassed or killed. It is quite astonishing, actually. I mean, I've read the forensic reports, and while 5 of the 6 gunmen were killed, only one of the hostages had already been executed by the gunmen. There were only 2 fatalities. There were some extremely serious injuries among the hostages. But on balance, it was astonishing. I mean, it was hailed as an extraordinary victory. And one of the interesting things I think about that is that it became a kind of emblem of Margaret Thatcher's approach to terrorism. She had been in power for less than a year at this point. It was probably the most difficult decision she had to make. If it had gone the other way and the thing had ended in a bloodbath, as many believed it would, I mean, even the SAS believed that there would be 40% casualties during this assault. Had that happened, the story of modern British politics would be very different. The SAS might have been disbanded. There are people in the SAS who believe that at this point the SAS was already under pressure and might not have existed. It might have it might have been absorbed elsewhere in the army. So in a way, the long-term significance of this story is both political and military. I mean, it really does change the landscape, and its very success does that.
And what do you think it did do for the SAS?
Again, this is rather a controversial argument. I mean, one of the things it did for the SAS was immediate, that it thrust them into the limelight. Most people had never heard of the SAS at this point. They were a shadowy part of the military. They were operating in Northern Ireland, but very not widely known about. When they were known about, pretty controversial. These were tough days for the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So they suddenly overnight became celebrities. Applications to join the SAS rocketed. The long-term effects of it you can still see today in the mystique that surrounds the SAS of kind of daring do, who dares wins. We go in, all those television programs about how tough can you be. They're in a way the direct descendant of this story. But there are people who feel that it actually did not benefit the SAS in the long run. Michael Rose is one of them. Michael Rose will tell you that actually this made life for the SAS much more difficult because they could no longer operate in the shadows. They could no longer operate with total covert knowledge that they could do it in secrecy, and that made, in a way, their jobs much more difficult. They were now public figures, if you like, and in a way, it's something I think the SAS has wrestled with ever since. Is the sort of balance between secrecy and maintaining secrecy, and yet being public figures, if you like. So the difficulty is how to mesh those two things together.
Ben Macintyre, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Kate.
And Ben's book, The Siege, is out now. Mike, it really was an iconic moment, wasn't it? Did you see it go out live?
I did, yes. I'd just been in my first year of lecturing at University of Newcastle, talking about security issues, and there it was on the televisions in front of us, as Ben said, on a Monday night. And he mentioned there Margaret Thatcher and the transformative effect it had on her reputation, or the beginning of a transformative effect. And there's something else about Margaret Thatcher which is really important there, I think, is that she behaved in an ideal way for a prime minister, pure instinct. She said Willie Whitelaw, who's the deputy prime minister, will take over operational issues. So Willie will talk to me, he'll keep me informed, but Willie Whitelaw will keep his finger on this from a political point of view. But I'm telling you now, none of those people leave the embassy. Because she was aware that in the 1972 Munich massacre, the Germans had tried to play along with the idea that they'd allow the terrorists to get away, and the bus went to the airport, and then they tried to set up a rescue at the airport, and everybody got killed. It was a mess, complete mess. And she said, they die or they are arrested. There are the only two outcomes. I will not accept any other outcome. Kill them or arrest them. Nobody goes anywhere. And she said to Willie Whitelaw, that's it. You hold that line. Let them do what they need to do, but they die or they are arrested. That's my view. And she left it. And that's just what you want from a prime minister. Establish the basics, leave it to somebody else, get on with the rest of your work. And that was pretty critical. And that's, as Ben was saying, I mean, the SAS, they went into, and their view was, because there was shooting inside, because they felt they had to go in at that moment, and they'd already said, if the second person gets killed, we go in whatever. And so no arrests were contemplated. We kill them. We just shoot them. And the definitiveness of that, as he said, created a kind of mystique around the SAS. I mean, they can deliver. The job of the special forces is to be reconnaissance. That's what they do. What makes them special is that they can lie low in any circumstances and just report what they see. That's what they do. But if necessary, they will deliver paralyzing violence with the utmost prejudice. And they're trained to do it, and they did it there.
And one extra important piece of context, Mike, this was at the same time as a hostage crisis at the US Embassy in Iran, where more than 50 people were being held captive, and that lasted more than a year.
Yeah, and it went terribly wrong for Jimmy Carter because they tried to mount a rescue mission which involved helicopters and aircraft, and they got to Desert 1, which was their first base. Then they had to get to Desert 2, then they had to get into the embassy and bring the hostages out. It was a typical Mission Impossible Hollywood-esque thing. They didn't get past first base, quite literally. They got to Desert 1, and because they were not able to practice it properly, one of the helicopters collided with one of the aircraft, set up a fire, and the whole thing was called off in a farcical tragedy that cost lives. And, Jimmy Carter, I don't think he ever recovered from that. He tried to be the president who set up a Hollywood rescue, and it went wrong literally at first base at Desert 1.
So, Mike, really good to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time today, as ever. And thanks to all of our guests. There's much more of my conversation with Ben Macintyre, including how and why the siege in London began. You can hear the whole thing in an extra edition of the Sitrep podcast online now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. That's if you're not up a mountain somewhere in the Lakes District, Mike. We'll see. Until now, from me, Kate Gerbeau. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.